We are very lucky today to have Paul leading our session. He's an organisational behaviour consultant, human factors trainer and airline pilot with over 25 years experience. I'm going to hand over to Paul and he can introduce himself properly and get started on today's session.
Thanks, Claire. Welcome, everyone. Yeah, just a little bit more about me before we start. I've been an airline pilot for 31 years, and in all of that time, we've been completely embedded in aviation, in human factors. About 6 years ago, I became a human factors instructor, also did an MBA, and became director of a couple of companies, mainly in the aerospace sector, doing research and development. So what I want to stress is that what we're going to talk about today isn't the latest thing from HBR. It's something that I've been immersed in. It's something that I'm a practitioner of, and it absolutely works under the most complex and dynamic situations. So just an overview of what we'll be covering. We'll start with what human factors are and where they came from. And then we'll have a look at why human factors can be beneficial to businesses beyond the safety critical ones, which is the ones that are really already associated with them. And then we'll have a look at an overview of what's covered on the NobleProg course. And then at the end, as Claire said, we'll have some time for your questions. We do have quite a broad spread of roles and industries represented today, so I'll keep it intentionally high level. That might mean that you'll have questions, but given the time available, if, as Claire says, if you could save them till the end, use the chat function and we'll try to get to them at the end. If I don't get time, I'll definitely follow up after the webinar to make sure that I can answer your question. So let's have a look at the first slide. Thanks, Claire. So human factors, what are they and where did they come from? Well, the post-war era witnessed a tipping point where technological advances outpaced the ability of people to adapt to and compensate for complexity and poor design. And it became most evident in aircraft crashes. That's where it all started. We had highly trained pilots crashing aircraft due to problems with new control configurations, new instrument presentations. And so despite the technology increasing the capability of the aircraft, the accident and incident rates didn't really improve. We also had radar contacts being missed by very motivated and experienced air traffic controller operators. And the more we looked, the more we found that this was expanding. This outpacing of human abilities was expanding into other sectors as time went on. So in the 60s and 70s, we had computer hardware and software. In the 80s, nuclear power plants, nuclear weapon systems. In the 90s, the internet, manufacturing automation, and then more recently, adaptive technology. That's to name just a few. Progressively, industries and academics began to realize that the ability to reach the desired levels of operational and strategic performance didn't just depend on the human or the technology alone. It depends on how well the human, the machine, and the process interact together to create a system. Another milestone in the development of the field was the work of a couple of academics, Rumler and Brach, who recognized that in order to explain behavior accurately, we need to think of a broader organization. And this is what came to be known as systems thinking, the core belief of which is that every individual operates within the context of a system, and improvements are only possible if we understand that system. So according to them, and I'm quoting now, most attempts to improve human performance are doomed to failure from the start because they proceed from the fundamentally flawed assumption that people perform in a vacuum. And with that in mind, human factors seeks to develop both individual and organizational capabilities. If we go back to aviation, where human factors practice is arguably most mature, it's been found that decision-making error has been attributed to around 70% of fatal accidents in aviation. So have a think about that for a minute. This isn't technical or structural failure. This is failure of the human factor. And we might reasonably assume that a similar error rate exists elsewhere. The only difference really is that aviation has a habit of candidly undertaking forensic analysis of human behaviour. So what started out as a fairly narrowly defined breakaway, if you like, of experimental psychology, focusing on the interaction of people with machine controls, has actually grown to encompass almost any interaction of people with the surroundings. And that brings us to a definition. Click, please, Claire. And there it is. The objective of human factors is to optimize the relationship between the human operators, the technology, and the environment. Next slide, please, Claire. So why are human factors useful to us in business? Well, we all know that we've been operating in an increasingly dynamic environment. Change is ubiquitous, as they say, particularly in the past 10 years, whether it's digital transformation, technical complexity, market demand change, and external events. We all know about that at the moment, don't we? Contemporary organisation and management theories quite correctly preoccupied by complexity, by the complexity of our operating environments and the need for flexibility and resilience, both in individuals and organisation. Resilience, it's a word that we hear regularly, isn't it? So to achieve resilience, there's been a movement away from bureaucratic structures. And it's a key recurring theme of both real world experience and academic research. On top of the operational challenges, we know that uncertainty and change in our operating environment presents real challenges to strategic planning. So if we're going to quickly respond to change, we need these flexible forms of organisation and leadership. And we certainly need committed and empowered employees. We need people in our organisations that are given the flexibility to make decisions and to take responsibility. And it's by doing this that we're giving our leadership teams much greater scope in strategic planning, despite the fact that we're operating in an unpredictable environment. So we know that we need to develop these capabilities in our people. So why aren't we doing it? Or why aren't we doing it well? Well, the blunt answer is that up until recently, I don't think we've really known how, because we've generally focused on easily quantifiable and measurable approaches. If we can measure it, we can do something about it, can't we? Approaches that address the technology and the processes in our system, in our organisation. So we get the evolution of continuous improvement initiatives like Six Sigma, total quality management, just in time, business process re-engineering. That's all great, but that means that there's mainly been a focus on equipment and process reviews. So where does that leave the people? Where does that leave the people in our systems, in our organisations? Well, we've considered people, but really only in the context of how they work with the technology and with the processes. We've provided technical training for staff. We've become really good at that. We might even have sent them on the odd team building course, but we've tended to concentrate on the easily measurable stuff. Our managers might have been given some leadership training. Now, leadership training is a completely different discussion, but consider this. It's been studied for over 2,000 years, and we still don't have a standardized, universally accepted definition of what it is. It varies by culture, it varies by industry, varies by organization, it even varies by department within an organization. So, of course, we're going to get inconsistencies in leadership, some good, some bad. So we've trained our people to be good technically, but evidence shows that the cause of poor performance in people, it's rarely the lack of technical skill, because we don't perform in a vacuum. We perform in a system, an organisation. In other words, if you put a really good performer in a bad system or a bad culture, that system will win every time. And that brings us on to culture change. Culture change traditionally has been seen as an absolute last resort, and probably an expensive last resort, something which is definitely an overhead cost that you're backed into a corner spending rather than an investment. So certainly creating a culture where behavioural change is put into practice through an openness to learning and a willingness to acknowledge lessons learned is still far from being the norm. In fact, we'll cover culture in more depth a little bit at the end of this webinar and then in some forthcoming webinars. So for lots of reasons, we've overlooked non-technical training for our people, and we've overlooked our organisational cultures for our system. And that brings us specifically onto human factors, because human factors provides the ability to develop people and culture at the same time. So how does it do that? Next slide, please, Claire. So over the past 30 years or so that human factors have been practiced mainly in the safety critical industries, a set of key competencies have been identified. Proficiency in these key competencies ensures that we have engaged, motivated, capable individuals and a resilient organisation that's able to minimise exposure to risk and error and create a strategic response to those errors that do occur by learning from them. There are 6 that we've identified that are most relevant to business, and we'll go through them now. First one being situational awareness. Click, please, Claire. So situational awareness, as you'd expect, is about retaining a focus on what matters. And this is really the keystone competence, because it's usually a prerequisite of performing well in the other competencies. It's about anticipating varying circumstances by gathering information, recognizing the context of that information, and then understanding intent. Now that sounds a little bit flowery, doesn't it? So we can break that down into plain language of it is what, so what, and what now. What's happening? So what does that mean for me? And what am I going to do about it? And if we think about it in something that we can all relate to, a car journey, let's say we're going on holiday. We might not be able to relate to that at the moment, but I'm sure we will do again at some point. If we're on a car journey, going to holiday, and there's a forecast for heavy snow. If we're at the lowest level of situational awareness, we know that the journey time is usually 90 minutes, and we set off 90 minutes before we want to arrive, and we deal with whatever happens on the journey with weather, roads, etc. in that way. If we're at the next level of situational awareness, the so what level, you'd understand that bad weather might mean slow traffic and road closures. And if we're at the highest level of situational awareness, the what now, you'd have seen the bad weather and the heavy snow forecast, and you'd decide to leave early enough to deal with it, or go the night before, or go on the train. In other words, you would have avoided exposure to the risk that heavy snow brings. One of the problems with situational awareness is that it degrades with time. So there's a need to constantly update it with new information. So if we're in the car, if we go back to the car analogy, you'd use your sat nav, you'd use the radio, you'd use the road signs to continually update your situational awareness. Now, something that we've found when we've worked with organizations is that there's a misconception that lots of data, lots of information equals situational awareness. Lots of accurate, up-to-date data gives you SA. If you go back to the car, ask yourself the question, does the sat-nav provide you with situational awareness? No, it provides you with information, with data. It's up to you to understand what that data means and know what to do about it. And if we think about situational awareness in the context of managing threats and errors, we know that high situational awareness is what we want. If we're working at the highest level of situational awareness, the what now, what am I going to do about it, we're able to avoid threats. We're able to think ahead, generate alternative plans of action that avoid the threat. If we go down a level and we're thinking about the so what level, we're just trapping threats. We understand the context of the information that we're getting and we understand what it means for our operation. But at the lowest level of situational awareness, all you're doing is mitigating threats, you're firefighting. We've got no capacity to project forward and we're dealing with events as they appear. How many times have you seen that? Or you might have even been at that level yourself. I certainly have. So obviously, for maximum resilience, we want to be at the highest level of situational awareness all the time. And that brings us on to the next competence, which is decision making. In most critical incidents that lead to business failure, key decisions have been made either too late or not at all. If we take the example of the Deepwater Horizon oil rig disaster, you might be familiar with that. They made a film about it. Anyway, it was a terrible disaster, the biggest oil spill ever, 11 people died. And the accident report tells us that 8 safety parameters were breached. Staggeringly, really, only one of those was attributed to a technical failure. So the other 7 were human failures, most of which we can put down to poor leadership or low situational awareness. But one of those breaches was a classic example of what we call confirmation bias in decision making. The increase in the well pressure that preceded the blowout was diagnosed as a fairly benign side effect of modern drilling called bladder effect. That mental model became entrenched, even in the face of information contradicting it. That mental model was entrenched and stuck to. And as a result, a chain of poor decisions was allowed to continue. So this module is about maintaining objectivity and making authentic quality decisions. The intent of human factors decision making is the ability and the flexibility to make potentially complex decisions without referring up the hierarchical management chain. It goes back to resilience again. And in order to do that, we cover the different types of decision making, the potential pitfalls like confirmation bias, which we just talked about, groupthink, and we offer a simple structure for the most complex and challenging types of problem solving and the consequent decision making. And that brings us on to the next competence. Click, please, Claire. Great. And this is workload management. Now, workload management isn't just about recognizing overload in yourself. It's not just about making life easier for yourself. We do go through structures that help manage personal workload because despite our best efforts, that will occasionally happen, obviously. But there's an emphasis on using your team as a resource. We can manage our own workload and simultaneously increase the capability of our team and develop and coach the people in it. If we take delegation as an example, we know that we can't be everywhere, so we have to delegate. But we don't just delegate workload, we delegate responsibility in human factors. Helping to coach the people in your team to become better at leading, to become better at decision making. They're not just taking workload, they're taking decision making and they're taking leadership. So you're unlocking a person's potential to maximize their performance. You're engaging them, you're challenging them, and you're embedding that resilience in your team. So these initiatives to delegate and encourage decision making also engender trust. So it's a great strategy. It can be really beneficial if you're working in a low trust culture and you're looking to build relationships. I'm conscious that time's getting on now. I'm a bit behind schedule. So let's move on to the next one, communication. Thanks, Claire. So communication in human factors is about exchanging information clearly, concisely, acting assertively when it's required, inquiring, clarifying, showing advocacy, listening. Big long list of words. What does it all mean? Well, the best way to illustrate this is with a story, and it involves one of our colleagues. He was in the cockpit of an Airbus, an A320, 150 people on board. He's lined up on one of the busiest runways in the world. It was his first few days as the newest pilot in one of the most high-profile airlines in the world. So not a time to get things wrong. He really wants to make a good impression. And his captain asked him in a neutral, quiet voice, "What do you think we're cleared to do?" Now I'm going to pause the story there and just go into a bit of background. The worst disaster in aviation history happened on the ground. And the cause was just a simple mistake. 2 aircraft collided on the runway and 583 people died. And it was because one aircraft started to take off without a clearance to do so. So since then, we all know that you always get a clearance before starting your takeoff run. So this was in the back of his mind. And when his colleague turned and asked about their clearance, his mind raced. He was about, had he made a huge error? Had he misheard? Had he misunderstood instructions? Anyway, he answered what he thought he'd heard, and he said, "I think we're clear to take off." And the captain smiled and said, "I agree." And he advanced the throttles and off they went. Now that was over a decade ago. And he still recalls that moment as an experienced pilot now, striking him as a really elegant and simple way of avoiding making such a deadly mistake. With no hint of what his own opinion was, the captain asked, in a totally neutral way, another opinion of a critical situation. Unfortunately, the painful evidence in aviation investigations, and aviation, as I've already said, has this habit of very candidly looking at itself. It shows that in so many fatal accidents, at least one member of the team had a doubt, had a concern. But for all sorts of reasons, that doubt, that concern, it might have been fear of embarrassment, it might have been doubt in their own judgment. It didn't get aired, or it didn't get effectively acted upon. We all love to confirm our own biases, especially when we're under pressure. We get this entrenchment of mental models, this confirmation bias, which we talked about earlier. We only consider the data which confirms our own mental model. People assume that others know what they know. So the way you ask a question shapes the answer that you're going to get. And open questioning is just one example of a key behavioral technique that we can apply to any team working situation, regardless of the setting. Empowering people to speak up improves the performance of the team. Having said that, it can require a shift of mindset. Yet you have to embed these skills through practice for them to work. We do find challenge uncomfortable. We don't look for it. Some people avoid it, but verbalizing doubt is not a challenge to authority. In fact, I'd say that it's a duty. Actually, a duty probably sounds a bit old-fashioned. Let's say it's a responsibility for team members to venture an opinion, particularly if they have a concern. You can grow a culture of trust by asking others about their opinion without displaying your own first, or asking them to express concerns and listening to them and thanking them when they do. So it's not about being nice. That's quite a common misconception, that human factors is about being nice. It's not that. It's about being effective. So next competence. Thanks, Claire. And this is knowledge and application of procedures. This is the link between non-technical training that we're looking at here in human factors and the technical training, the skills training. This is where we stress the importance of standard operating procedures. So why do we need standard operating procedures? Well, because they provide a standard way of doing things, obviously, but they also help us grow situational awareness, because knowing a procedure frees up capacity to consider other information, other data. Now, in our time doing this, being involved in human factors, we've come across organisations that have standard operating procedures in their operations manual, but they haven't been updated for ages. So they're no longer relevant, which means that people end up making up their own procedures. Now, if we think about this in terms of risk management, if you're familiar with risk management and the 3 lines of defence principle, we've got day-to-day risk management as defence number 1, how things are done at the coalface, if you like. And defence number 2 is compliance, your company rule set, and defence number 3 is the audit function. If you don't have SOPs or checklists, or if you have them and they're not up to date, you're leaving that first line of defence, the day-to-day risk management, open to people's heuristics and biases. The less investment that's put into that first line of defence, the more you're going to backload the other 2 lines of defence. So putting SOPs in place and having people with the knowledge and the understanding of how to correctly apply them gives an organisation a really robust first line of defence. Next competence, please, Claire. So this one, leadership and teamwork, is going to be the one that you're most familiar with. And I don't want to try and reinvent the wheel because you will ask why this is any better than any other leadership concept that you know. So I'm just going to cover a few of the underlying assumptions of what leadership looks like in a human factors context. Incidentally, an extra challenge for us in the UK. There's a study by a group called the Meaning of Work International Research Team, and they found that work is most important to the Japanese and least important to the British. And on top of that, the desire for interesting work came top of those features desired by the British. So we are a difficult crowd to please in the UK. So going back to these assumptions, we'll have a look at the first ones that are around motivation. So leaders are looking to create a culture where we motivate behavioural change through an openness to learning and a willingness to acknowledge lessons learned. I've mentioned that before. But it has to go hand in hand with open, honest communication, because that encourages team cooperation. We create a common understanding of purpose, and because there's a common understanding of purpose, we get a sense of group belonging, so that when we coach individuals in our team, they're fully engaged. They're not only being developed as individuals, they're enhancing the capabilities of the team. If we look at leadership in the context of threat and error management, after all said and done, people make mistakes. We can avoid, we can trap, and we can mitigate the most error-likely situations, but people do make mistakes. The important thing to remember is that those mistakes are rarely malicious, even in organisations that are absolutely steeped in conflict. They're usually well-meaning and they're usually intended to get the job done. Understanding the context surrounding errors and mistakes and implementing defences based on the learning from that can help reduce the severity of future incidents. Have no doubt that leaders influence individual behaviours. How we as leaders respond to failure really matters. So it's important to suspend judgment, put that aside, respond with curiosity. We shift the focus from the person to the system, and as a result, we develop much better preventative or corrective actions. So they're the 6 competencies, but I've already mentioned that we don't perform in a vacuum, we perform in a system. So let's look at a couple of elements of the system that can influence our competence. One more click, please, Claire. So we look at stress and pressure. So regardless of the organisation we belong to, I'm sure that we can all relate to the effects that stress and pressure have on our own performance. And it's no different here. Stress affects our ability to perform well in the different competencies. Despite this, not acknowledging stress or pressure is still really prevalent. We don't want to appear weak. We don't want to undermine our own position of authority. If we go back to the Deepwater Horizon incident, that rig was 41 days behind schedule at a cost of $500,000 a day. So you're talking about $20 million in deficit. What would that knowledge do to you as a supervisor or a manager? And if you set that chain of poor decisions in context and you add that stress into it, it starts to make a little bit more sense. So we go through some strategies to recognize stress in ourselves and in others, and look at some strategies for managing it. Something that's come to light fairly recently, it's been found fairly recently, is the benefit of having peer support programs in an organization. I think it was PwC that claimed that demonstrating that degree of commitment to the health and well-being of the people in your company not only improved engagement, but it actually enhanced productivity as well. I can't put my finger on the actual percentage uplift in productivity, but it was definitely quite significant. And they don't have to be expensive things to instigate or time consuming, because increasingly we're seeing that there are specialist organizations that can be contracted to do it outside of your own. One more thing that I want to have a look at in terms of the system that we're operating in. So one more click, please, Claire. And that's an open reporting culture. We can be excellent proponents of non-technical and technical competencies, but if the organizational culture is wrong, it'll stifle that performance absolutely every time. Human factors culture, as we've already said, embraces learning by acknowledging that mistakes are going to happen. We take blame and we take judgment out of the equation. We look at what happened, not why it happened, with a view to eliminating that threat in future. It's how the organization learns. And it's only if individual actions are clearly grossly negligent or egregious does disciplinary action actually become appropriate and enter the equation at all. And certainly in aviation, we've been reporting our errors openly through these things called air safety reports for decades. And the assumption isn't that we'll be disciplined, but that we'll be able to help our colleagues avoid a similar situation in future. So that culture of open reporting is absolutely crucial to having an operational feedback loop that allows the organization to learn. Right, now that forms the basis of the NobleProg course that we've put together. I do feel like I've rattled through that, so I apologize if I've bombarded you with a monologue. I hope it's at least giving you something to think about and perhaps something that you want to have a look at further. We do have a few minutes left to, I have overrun a little bit, but we've got a few minutes left to cover some questions. So we've got one here from Andrea. And Andrea asks, how can human factors help facilitate digital transformation? That's a good question. It's increasingly asked, this question as well. It's something that a lot of companies seem to be going through. It's difficult to go into any degree of detail without being absolutely familiar with the organization, but the most digitally mature companies, those that are furthest along the road in terms of technological integration, are also the ones that have most embraced human factors. So aerospace, oil and gas, medicine, etc., they already clearly see a value in it. Specifically, I mean, the whole reason that it came about was because of the advances being made in technology. The whole purpose is to find the optimal fit between people, technology, and process. So I can't really think of a better approach to facilitating digital transformation. Have we got time for one more, Claire?
Yep, we could do one more question. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
So James says, what other examples have you got in business of the benefits of human factors training? Well, one that I haven't mentioned is lost time injuries. We've worked with an oilfield services contractor that's seen a real marked reduction in absence, and there's no reason to believe that that isn't something that would occur more broadly. In fact, if you think about increasing employee engagement and motivation, it's probably something that we'd expect to happen. I did mention the mental health benefits, but research so far, I mean, the PwC survey's been done, but it's fairly scant, it's fairly thin on the ground. Having said that, anecdotally, we hear good things, and I'd expect there to be tangible benefits there as well. I think we've probably run out of time, Claire. So
yeah.
If there are any more questions, I know that I haven't answered all of them there, but if you do have any more questions, if anything occurs to you later, then please feel free to contact us and I'll definitely answer any questions that you have. Claire, do we have Anthony on or not?
Let me have a just check. Yes, yep, we have.
Right.
Do you want to introduce him a minute?
Yeah, okay. So Anthony will be doing some podcasts in the future, or a podcast in the future, which covers human factors and culture, which is his area of expertise. So Anthony might actually be able to give us a little bit more of a cultural slant on what we've just been discussing, and perhaps segue into his webinar as well. So over to you, Anthony.
So I think this ties really well to the idea of managing organisational culture. As Paul mentioned earlier on, it's very much pushed to the back in terms of investment in organisation seen as a last resort. The way in which you manage organisational culture is very tightly linked to training human factors, because it's an excellent inroad into transferring some of the values and attitudes from senior management to the people that actually go out and do the job on the coalface. It's a great way of directing some of the principles that you want people to engage with their work with. And right across the sphere, I mean, when we, from an aviation perspective, look at risk management, it tends to be in the more dynamic, from a more dynamic perspective, rather than process-driven, which is perhaps typical of some areas, perhaps more typical of most areas of business. I think what human factors allows us to do is to combine the two approaches, sometimes referred to as a realist approach with a critical approach, that you just look back and sense check what you're doing in a day-to-day way. And I think it's particularly relevant to middle management.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. We're going to wrap up there. Thank you to Paul for leading such an interesting session. That's been really useful, and I think it's given a great insight into what we offer and how our courses can be beneficial to every organisation.